As a professional, I will tell you to prepare because this is serious, meticulous neuron processing we're about to undertake. Now everyone hold hands and squeeze your butt cheeks together.
Happy holidays, Gothamites. Welcome to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond. She's Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. We're here. We made it.
We did make it. We've made it so far anyway. But something feels like it's missing. We usually have a little treat from you on our holiday show.
I do have that treat for you.
Excellent.
This is my annual holiday gift for everybody.
Please proceed.
'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through G City, the villains were stirring and getting real pretty. The Legion of Doom held their annual party, exclusive to the criminal underworld's most naughty. New to the scene is Harley Quinn, the ex-partner of the Clown Prince of Crime, also known as the Joker. The A-list of villains indulge in depravities, while their prefrontal cortex are lacking capacities. The rooms fill stories of vices and crime. That wasn't a complete sentence, was it?
Was that part of your poem?
No. No cuts. The rooms fill with stories of vices and crime, with B-cluster traits and narcissism dialed real high. On Two-Face, on Riddler, on Bane, Mr. Freeze, on Penguin, on Scarecrow, Maxie Zeus, and Steve. There is a glass ceiling, as Ivy warned. You're gonna need a crew and skin made of thorns. If you want what they have, as she waved at their toys, you must work smarter and harder than the boys. But no matter the dangers and harms of the drama, it is never too late to work on your trauma. And to all, a good day, and to all a good night. I have no idea. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
Nicely done. Nicely done. That one might have been more intricate than any of your previous. I guess that's the whole point, is every year they get a little better.
They get a little bit more complicated and more difficult to read and recite. But truly, it is. This is the most fun. I get a real weird indulgent delight in writing these every year. It's always tied to whatever it is we're covering. Mm-hmm. Harley Quinn is so juicy and filled with so many wonderful characters and stories. So this is so much fun. But truly, this is the time to really, again, be grateful for our listenership and the folks that join us virtually every year around this time. This time of year can be very complicated just in terms of emotional responses, filled with being with family, missing family, grief and loss, sadness, some hopefulness, and some uncertainty, certainly for a lot of people. So complicated emotions, but hopefully we can just spice it up for folks, add a little bit of joy to their holiday plans, whether you're out traveling, vacationing, listening to this podcast in your car, in the bathtub, in bed, while you're doing your makeup, whatever it is, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's such, I cannot say this intensely enough. It is so, I'm so appreciative that we're a part of your holidays.
And you know what I'm also appreciative of is the fact that between now and our next episode, you will be celebrating a birthday. So happy birthday, Drea. I'm appreciative for you and for your birth. Without you, I don't know where the show would be. Frankly, nowhere. It would not exist.
Thank you.
But happy birthday. If anyone wants to send gifts, send them care of. No. But people can, as a birthday present, join your Discord. Like join our Discord.
If you wonder, what do I want? Yes, a great point. What do I want for my birthday? What do I want for the holidays? Join our Discord. It's free. The link is in our Instagram bio. If you are not sure where to find it, shoot us an email at thearkhamsessions@gmail.com. And I'll send you the link. It's a cool place.
A couple of big pieces of DC news this week. One of which I'm sure you are super excited about. The other, I don't know how you feel. We'll start with the I don't know, just so I can figure out exactly how you feel about this. The teaser trailer for James Gunn's new Superman film was released. If you've not seen it and don't want spoilers, check it out before continuing further, because I'm about to ask Drea.
Skip ahead like 60 seconds.
Yeah, what'd you think? In 60 seconds, what'd you think?
Okay, so I just watched it. So I watched it with the sound off a couple days ago when it was released. I just watched it right before we recorded the show. I'm so excited. This is, I'm not a huge Superman fan. I'm like casual fan of Superman. I don't know if we need another re-envisioning, another origin story, but this looks like you're just getting introduced to him at mid action. Like there's a lot of things that are already established. As of this morning, James Gunn said this was the most viewed trailer of any Warner Brothers or DC film. So it's already kind of hitting these records, these record highs. So I'm actually kind of excited. How did you feel about it?
Yeah, it's fine.
If people know about your relationship to Superman films, there's only so much we can say before we really get into a heated debate. What did you think of
heated debate?
No,
Superman, whatever. Like Superman's fine. I'm okay.
Well, how did you feel about all the? No, I mean, and I know we're getting to 60 seconds.
See, now we're going to get into the
Let me just say in the last second here, a few seconds here, Lex Luthor, Lois Lane, Guy Gardner, Crypto. This is just packed full of Superman characters. Mm-hmm. Like it's really interesting.
As a redhead, I can tell you that I don't really need Guy Gardner representing us in the new movie, and it appears he's not anyway, because they've taken the red hair away, they've left the bowl cut, but now they've made him like a blonde. So even if he's a character I don't want representing redheads, they've erased us somehow by making him a blonde character. And you know that I'm not a big fan of super pets. I don't really love Crypto. Don't love Crypto's existence in a realistic DC universe. But ultimately, it is what it is. Whatever. It's another Superman movie. Okay. I'll watch another Superman movie. I mean, I'll see it. I like James Gunn. Yeah. And I believe that he can create something that is entertaining and something that is emotional. But do I need another Superman movie?
Okay, let's talk about the other movie.
Okay, the other movie, the one that got you super excited, I'm sure. We've not discussed this, so I didn't even know if you knew about this.
I just found out.
But they also announced
a live-action Clayface movie. And I say this with so much excitement and a little nervousness, because this could get canned if this doesn't work out.
Yeah.
I know I'm keeping hopeful. I know it has already a lot of attention. and folks are backing it, but I'm just worried that this is one of those DC films that just doesn't end up happening for whatever reason.
I mean, let's think about it this way. If you're putting it into the realm of, and this is what I don't know, admittedly, I didn't go reading a bunch of articles about it. I saw Jim Lee's announcement. I saw James Gunn's announcement. I didn't really go digging further. We don't know how Clayface is going to be presented in this movie. We do not know if he's going to be an 8-foot tall mud person.
What else would he be?
So think about it this way. If you wanted to put him in the realm of like the Batman, or if you wanted to put him in the realm of the Penguin
Yep.
TV series, which we just covered, you could get away with simply a master of disguise.
Sure.
Tragically created one way or another. Like you could create a character that is using down to earth techniques to become anyone he wants, as opposed to a amorphic blob of clay that
Sure.
can become anybody he wants. So I would be very interested to know the direction in which they're going. Are they going the more cartoony comic book approach? And if so, is this going to be a fun Clayface movie, or is this going to be a serious Clayface movie? The fact that they are calling it Clayface certainly suggests he's the lead. And if he's the lead, he has to be our hero to some degree, an anti-hero perhaps. So it's not like we're going to necessarily be watching a movie about the villain Clayface. One could argue we watched a movie about the villain Joker, but again...
We also watched a whole series on the villain Penguin.
Correct. And in all those cases, those characters were sympathetic to
Sure.
some degree.
Sure.
So we ultimately need to sit back and wait, see what happens. But there are ways into either dynamic, whether you want comical mud person or whether you want, something that simply suggests I am Clayface without making him someone who can just transform into anybody he
Right.
wants. With a thought.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think it's a challenge to take this kind of character that's very rooted in the comic book, like heavy on like the monstrous villain like figure. This is someone who there's two elements of Clayface that I think are really essential to this character. One is what you're talking about, which is the ability to shapeshift.
Mm-hmm.
And psychologically, that's really a compelling thing. Do you know who are you if you can be all these different things? The other piece is that Clayface's natural form is an abomination. This is a monster. So how do they play up or dial down some of these things? I'm going to be curious. If he or they or she is not monstrous, is not monstrous in some way, I don't know that you truly have a Clayface type character.
So think about it this way. So if you had a character like, say, Darkman, which is a movie I know you've seen at least once. Whether you remember it is something else entirely.
Okay.
But in that, he was a monstrous looking. His skin had been burned off. He was all bandaged up.
Yeah.
But then he had worked out a polymer that he could use as a skin mask that after so much time would then begin to melt and dissolve. You could say that is sort of a Clayface. He can appear as anyone he wants, but it's temporary. It's going to start breaking down. It's going to fall apart. You could create a Clayface like that. Go with me on this. Something I would be super excited about because of Clayface's origin story. And we don't know if this is the origin that they're keeping, but the idea that he is a Hollywood actor, potentially successful at one time, failed. We don't know. We don't know which direction they're going. But if you had him be a Lon Chaney type, man of 1,000 faces, you look at Lon Chaney in his movies, you cannot ever see Lon Chaney in his movies. You know, whether he's a clown, whether he's the Hunchback of Notre Dame, whether he's the Phantom of the Opera. Lon Chaney becomes a different person every time. And famously, Lon Chaney did all of his own makeup. So I would be really keen to see a take on Clayface that approaches him as if he were a villainous Lon Chaney. But we'll see.
Now, I asked our Discord who should play Clayface.
Oh.
And I'll just read a couple of these. But Trevor suggests Javier Bardem. Could be an interesting choice. Age, maybe slightly older than I thought that maybe this character would be, but again, a shapeshifter.
Similar to Darkman, he has played a James Bond villain whose face can't stay intact necessarily. It begins to sort of.
Ooh. Yeah. No, they could play around with that.
Yeah.
And then Fungnus, I know I'm pronouncing this wrong, says, but think about the cameos that Clayface can change into.
Yeah.
So we're thinking about one actor, one person who could play this character, but maybe they could mix things up and there would be these cameos, these appearances of other well-known actors who are, exist in the universe, maybe. So yeah, some interesting things. But look, I'm on board. I think, yes, very, very difficult to directly translate this, very cartoonish character into live action. I think they're going to have to be creative about that. A very direct translation may fall flat. It may be overly ridiculous, like
you could do a cartoon, an animated movie, like a Spider-Verse type movie. You could do something like that with the clay version. You could do a Lego sort of, but in order to really focus on this clay version of Clayface, you almost need it to be a little bit more down to earth, unless they're going to turn it into something like, maybe they straight up do the first, would it be the first DC Universe horror film? Like, maybe who is Clayface? He could be any one of us. This could be
sort of like a psychological thriller.
Yeah, like you could turn this into something else.
Yeah.
You could turn it into The Thing.
Like, what if you don't actually need the monstrous figure until the very, very end, and it's done real well?
And it wouldn't make sense to have him be the monstrous figure throughout the movie anyway. The idea is that you want to save it for the climax. But then that
Jaws.
puts a lot of pressure on that look for the climax.
Yeah.
We'll see. I'm excited about the possibilities. There could be some really cool stuff.
I think we have almost 2 years to anticipate it.
Okay.
So yeah, some big news, some exciting things, some things to look forward to.
Yeah. We're talking Harley Quinn today, and we're talking a pretty massive episode of Harley Quinn. This is one that I knew was coming up and was one that I'm excited to talk to you about. We watched it again last night. You were vigorously taking down notes. I know that this is going to turn into a long episode because there are just all kinds of things to discuss, at least from my end, questions that I have.
I think this is the kind of episode that people should watch multiple times, because even in the second time watching it, you may even notice, and we'll talk through where the setting is, but we may notice details, the portrait or the paintings on the wall, these memories that are affixed to these hallways, these corridors that represent her mind. And so there's a fair amount of symbolism.
Let me interrupt you just enough to give context to what you're saying. We're talking about the episode being Harley Quinn. And in this episode, she basically freaks out to the point that she freezes. She goes into a mannequin-like state. And it's determined that her wiring has basically futzed out. She is no longer capable of functioning. She's basically in a living coma. She is trapped somewhere within her own mind. Dr. Psycho obviously can go into her mind, but folks like folks like Ivy and King Shark and Clayface are not going to let Dr. Psycho go in alone, so they all go in together. And the first thing they see is a large white room with, as you just mentioned, portraits of key memories hanging on the wall. This is her museum of memories, essentially. And while Dr. Psycho goes to do a hard reboot, as he says, on Harley, hopefully bringing her out of it, the others look at these memories and they find Harley there. Harley is there looking at these memories. So they're able to discuss with her what it is they're seeing. One of the very first things you see, and this leads me to my first of many questions, is an image of Harley as a small child playing with two Barbie-sized type dolls, one male, one female. One looks like it's a wrestler or something, and the other is like a Barbie. And interestingly, in the placard hanging with the image, it's basically like favorite memory or best memory or, whatever. Mm-hmm. And then when we start watching it, we see that she is recreating with these two dolls what is clearly an argument mommy and daddy have had at some point. And then she takes it a step further and she decapitates him. I want to ask you, for starters, how sad is it that one of her fondest memories is a recreation of an argument she has clearly heard many times? And second, you have always said that children are far more resilient when it comes to trauma than we like to give them credit for. We like to treat them with kid gloves. And by doing so, we may actually be doing them more harm in some cases. But you've also talked about the problem of constant trauma, like multiple traumatic events. What we're seeing in Little Harley, and especially as she becomes sort of a weaponized version of this same child throughout the episode, we see hundreds of little kid Harleys with red eyes attacking them with sharp teeth. First, talk about the resilience of children, and then talk about what you're seeing here with Harley and how that might ultimately lead to the Harleen Quinzel that we know now.
Mm-hmm. And I think that first part is really important to really emphasize, in that a lot of us as adults had experienced or have experienced hardships and traumatic events in our youth. And while it's true that those hardships can lead to some more longstanding future problems in adulthood, it's common enough that one or two difficult experiences, even traumatic experiences, can result in healthy outcomes. So I think that's one of the most important things to just clarify, is that trauma, especially in childhood, is not to be stigmatized, is not to be seen as something that isn't talked about, shouldn't be avoided, that it's more common than people believe, than people understand. Mm-hmm. And that if someone experiences trauma throughout their lifetime, and especially as a child, to be open-minded about that and not assume that that automatically means that they have any kind of serious mental illness. And when we think about Harley Quinn as a character, this is a very complex psychology. She has very complex a clinical presentation. This is somebody who aligned with the Joker for many, many years and is kind of coming back from that and healing from an abusive, toxic relationship. Yeah. So to start with her childhood is an interesting way to connect the dots and see how these things relate.
In one of those images, we even saw a family portrait, and the mother and father looked conspicuously like Al and Peg Bundy. So we know that this could not be a healthy family dynamic.
You don't see a lot. You see these kind of like snapshots, like actual portraits, right? These representations in her museum of memories is what I think Dr. Psycho calls it. And what is very accurate here, now of course we don't have museums of memories in our brains, but what's accurate is that some of our memories are very vivid and stay with us and become solidified and build our character. Other memories aren't designated as a portrait, right? Like aren't really cemented in our psyche in that way. And the ways in which we will remember things really depends on the emotions that happened at the time. People don't think about this enough, but the response of that situation, like what happens after the trauma is real key.
So explain that a little bit, because you have said, I mean, we'll take a dramatic, extreme version of trauma. We'll say like a school shooting.
Yeah.
You have said, actually, depending on the age of the child, they might recover from that really quickly, as long as we don't keep telling them that there was something traumatic that happened.
I think it's fine to say that it's important to validate that was life-threatening,
yes,
scary, traumatizing, will stay with you, and to normalize what happens in the first several weeks after a trauma. But during that time, it's also critical to provide safe support, consistent support, someone who, after something that felt so unsafe, is actually authentically safe. The environment is safe. The setting is safe. The people are safe. And it doesn't even necessarily take intense therapy for that.
Yeah.
But even the studies show that even one strong support system, like somebody who provides support, one strong supportive figure can be a very critical buffer against PTSD, depression, suicidality, and other things that may follow a trauma. So it's interesting. The trauma is important, quote, important, in that is essentially what can lead to illness. But it's also what is happening before, during, and after the trauma that creates the protective factors, the buffers, the processing that's needed. Our brains are so complicated and fantastic because we are biologically designed to overcome traumas.
Yeah.
That's what our brain does.
Yeah.
But something can kind of go awry. And when that happens, and we'll talk about what that actually looks like in the brain, that happened to Harley. And so when that happens, you have these distortions of memory. You have these vivid callbacks or flashbacks or solid memories of things that happened, like these arguments between her parents that really stuck with her. And I think that portrait is telling us, one, Harley was from a very young age forced to be an adult. We see her young, kind of isolated, playing out this very adult relationship between her parents that she witnessed. And as an aside, we don't know about any abuse toward her, but observing domestic violence or intimate partner violence can be a form of trauma. So for folks thinking like, well, she wasn't abused, well, other people were abused who she cares about. And I think that's important to clarify. So yeah, she had to kind of develop her identity around this familial environment, meaning what we saw, this reenactment, this re-traumatization, this replaying is almost a meta way of saying, it's almost giving the ending away. Yeah. It's saying Harley had to take these incredibly impactful, traumatic situations and replay them and retell them to herself and gain control over the power that they had over her. And in this case, decapitating dad's little toy body.
Right.
In order to defend herself, find power, find control. And so there's a lot that's said just even in that little scene. It's quite smart, that scene, and not overly triggering, right? Because this is an animated show, and it's really bold, but it also doesn't. I don't think it's like overly indulgent about these things.
Right. You mentioned the idea of faulty memory, repressed memories. You have said the idea of repressed memories is a little controversial, yes? Or at least recovering repressed memories is a little on the controversial side, yes?
Well, we've covered this in previous shows where certain techniques to draw out a memory are just, I want to say in a general sense, are unreliable.
Yeah.
And
hypnosis is unreliable.
Yeah. I mean, let's take hypnosis. Let's take other types of very well-intentioned therapies that suggest they're drawing out some memory that's been locked away and is not in the consciousness of a person as an adult. And very, very little research actually validates that, actually supports the idea that we can kind of resuscitate a memory that's hidden in the recesses of our brain. Now, let me say, can we recall something? Can you see something, a person, a facial feature, a song, a smell, and recall a memory that you hadn't thought about in a long time? Absolutely.
Will it necessarily be accurate? No, not likely.
I mean, memories tend to be very mixed in accuracy anyway.
Yeah.
So it's all about your interpretation, right? So where this is helpful is interpreting what that memory means to your current mood state, to your current level of functioning, to your reparative work. Where it's problematic is in court, where there's like so little science to support those techniques. That's where psychologists can get into real trouble using that as evidence that something did or did not happen.
So I was once, I know you know this, or I don't know if you remember, but I was once...
I don't remember.
I was
What you're
once
about to tell me.
nearly selected to be a juror on a trial where they openly admitted that there was no concrete evidence, that it was all circumstantial. And they asked me as a juror, would I have a problem in believing the victim when they were the one and only person who remembered who were there for the event, except for the accused? And would I be willing to take their account as truth and as fact? And I was like, no, absolutely not. Not that I'm trying to victim shame, or not that I'm trying to say that I don't believe that something happened to the victim. But if all I'm going on is the memory of someone who was going through something traumatic at the time, and that's what you want me to convict another person on, I can't do that. And I was like, my wife is a clinical psychologist. I've had this conversation a lot. And they're like, we
talk about this all the time.
They were like, can you put that aside? I'm like, no.
No. Oh, so they booted you right out of there.
I was the last person booted. They wanted me so badly.
Oh, they wanted you.
Well, the prosecutor kept asking me questions as if to be like, could you just please go along? Could you like, what is it that you don't like about this? Just go with this. Like, something about me might be, I'm, middle-aged white dude. Something about me the prosecutor wanted. And I'm like, sorry, I cannot put knowledge that I have aside in order to help you win a case that it sounds like you don't have much to go on anyway. And so I was the final person let go, which was good because I don't mind being on a case. I've been on an 8-week murder trial before. But you and I were going to like Disney World or something at the time. And I'm just like, you can't do it. I can't let that happen. So,
yeah.
So yes, I was very honest. It's not like I said that to get out of jury duty. I don't mind being a juror, but I have real problems with them asking me to use memory as your sole basis of evidence.
I'd say that psychologists and therapists working with someone to help them recover memories is likely more reliable than an investigator or an attorney or a non-licensed, a non-clinical person interviewing someone and persuading them or, having what I would call an agenda in the interviewing. In the legal system, you have an agenda, period. Like that's what you're supposed to do, right? But
is it possible that a psychologist, whether meaning to or not, could also have an agenda, and that
yes.
two psychologists on opposite sides might genuinely get the person to come up with two different memories?
Yes, and that's why we're trained to ask questions and interview in a very specific way, not to suggest certain responses, not to feed details, not to point questions a certain way. We have to be really careful, even if we're recovering memories notwithstanding. That's just how there's certain ways that we can tactfully ask about traumatic history without upsetting a person.
Yeah.
So I may have to be more direct with my questioning to better understand someone's history. But certainly we have to be very careful to not use that power dynamic, whether intentionally or not, to get more information out of somebody. It's a very delicate process. And I want to go back to the Harley Quinn show, that in this episode, what I really appreciate about starting with her childhood experience is that it does tell us that she was raised by parents who were abusive toward one another. And that's important to note, that from a young age, she saw relationships as volatile and potentially toxic and coercive and based on a power dynamic. And when you grow up with that in your household, now we don't know how long she stayed in that household or what the end result was. I don't remember them telling us if her parents ever separated or anything like that. But what was important there is for us to understand that she formed schema around relationships, around what were supposed to be loving relationships, in a way that simply was unhealthy.
Can I ask you a question that clearly was not meant to be asked or delved too far into when the writers and animators were doing this show, but is clearly something that I've been thinking about? What does it say to you if one of the fondest memories someone has is not of the event itself, but in a recreation of the event with toys later? Like one of her fondest memories was her playing with the dolls and recreating it.
You're talking,
or not fondest, but one of the most powerful memories to her was her sitting at a table playing with her dolls and recreating this dynamic versus actually having seen the fight.
Well, you mentioned the writers because they simply could not put that scene. Are you saying they're not going to put that scene?
Say that one of her most dynamic memories was, mom and dad being abusive toward one another, and the show's about Harley, so we're going to see baby Harley. We're going to see a little girl.
Yeah.
But to me, it's an interesting thought, the idea that this moment playing at the table with her toys is more memorable than the actual event that she was recreating at the time that she was playing with her toys.
Well, it's interesting because I see that as one of the most salient memories.
Yeah.
And that means that had an impact on her.
Yeah.
So it's completely through, and this is just my interpretation of the episode. Mm-hmm. This is the version of Harley's psychology or, mental states, her psyche, through other people's experiences. I don't feel like especially going through the Museum of Memories, it's like a therapist. It's like a bystander. It's like her friends learning and uncovering and discovering these things. And so I see it as, okay, this is your most salient memory. And for some reason, this is salient because there's some joy or delight in this.
Yeah.
Where did that delight come from? Where does that come from?
And it shows the origin story of her taking delight in maiming.
Yeah.
As well.
I mean,
like she had a great deal of joy on her face when she decapitated the head of the wrestler.
Yeah. I wrote down like violence.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, and so one can argue that is that violence inherent?
It seems like that's the moment that made this one of the core memories, was like, this is the first time she went that far, and that was pleasurable for her.
This violence is fulfilling.
Yes.
This violence is, and I'll just say, this is going to sound so technical, but like chemically, this violence relieves something in me. It's cathartic. It feels both good and bad. And I think for someone that young, it's like, I think as a therapist, I'd say, like, that's something to note. Look, this could be inherited because we know that both her parents were involved in this abusive relationship, but some of this is obviously environmental. She's witnessing that problems are solved through violence. And so once she makes the decision to actively use violence to shut him up, right? The dolls. Who has dolls of their parents?
Well, she didn't have dolls of her parents.
These are just dolls.
Yeah, she had like a Barbie and like a GI Joe or
Got it.
But it was clearly,
they weren't meant to be.
It was clearly representations of her parents.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you said they were of her parents.
No, they're meant to be her parents, but I think one was like a wrestler, so like one looked like an action figure, and the other looked like a Barbie.
Sorry, I got distracted and wondered about that. Yeah, so that could be something to note. I don't necessarily want to call it a red flag, but we're starting very young with physical violence, serious physical violence being
and is
marker.
That based on the norms of society? Because if you saw a little boy decapitating their action figure, that's just a little boy being a little boy.
I wouldn't necessarily. It's all whether she was Harley Quinn or if this was the Joker, I'd still be concerned. I'd still wonder about the lack of safety in this home environment. But she also said, like, look, I didn't know you were going to talk about gender. Is this Gotham City? Like, actually, is this just fitting with a very dreary and violent place to live?
I mean, it looked like a nice place. Like, it looked like, I remember like the kitchen was sort of a shiny white. It was almost like a 50s style, like, oh, this is where she comes, little girl. We're talking about the past. Therefore, we're talking about an aesthetic that's clean and, whatever.
That's something to think about, too. She may have had a very privileged upbringing just in terms of socioeconomic status.
We then see that she becomes the valedictorian when she graduates from college. And rather than give an inspirational speech, she basically tells off everybody, calls out certain professors that were doing inappropriate things, but also is just sort of, it sets the stage for a rebel and for someone who is clearly smarter than everyone else, has achieved a great deal, but also does not care what others think about her anymore. Mm-hmm. She is ready to let all of them go.
Yeah, I noted that. I did this on my own. Now, did she?
I thought you were going to say, I also did this.
I also did this. When
I graduated,
I gave a speech. So I was valedictorian, but I was.
You were valedictorian?
Yeah, I was. But let me kind of unpack this a little bit. We did not use the name valedictorian because at my high school that was considered, it was like an undesirable language to use. It drew competition. It seemed very unfair. Like no one used that word. But what we did use was rankings. And so out of 484 students in my class, in my graduating class, we would use rankings. So you would know your number. I think we've even talked about...
That's even worse.
We've talked about this on the show,
You're like,
actually.
I'm number one. Like,
yeah.
Like it's one thing to say I'm valedictorian. Who cares? What does that even mean? I am number one.
So I was number one. But the asterisk next to my name was and these are internal conversations.
You were doping. You were using steroids.
No.
You were. So there's an asterisk. Okay.
You actually didn't know people's numbers. You would only know your number by meeting with your counselor, and they would tell you, here is your ranking, and throughout your sophomore, junior, senior year. And there were actually at one point 3 of us who were all number one. So I think my junior year, I knew that there were 2 other people that had the same GPA, and as things unfolded by senior year, by the time we graduated and grades were in, there were 2 of us at number one. The person who was asked to give what you would know as the valedictorian speech was a student who was also a cheerleader, the ASB president, and I'd say like conventionally popular, like well liked. She was chosen to do the speech, and I think it's because she was ASB. Do you know what ASB? Actually,
No.
don't even know what it stands. It's almost like high school level, like ASB president. Like you are.
I mean, I know what various class presidents.
Yeah, like
Yes.
basically that. Look, very well liked person, very known person. It made sense to me.
Sure.
And would probably
Takes the pressure off of you.
and would probably give a speech that was appropriate. At that time, I had been
You were like Hot Topic, Drea?
let me just say this. I'll give one anecdote. We got to move on. But at that time, I had already been called in to the office because I had spikes on my backpack, like these like giant metal, like probably like 2-inch metal spikes that I got on Hot Topic. And they were just on the straps of my backpack. Mm-hmm. And I got into trouble, and it was like one of the only times I've ever been in trouble. And I was told that this is a violation of the student conduct code, that our dress code, is violated because these are sharp objects. You're not supposed to have that. And it was like the only time I've ever talked back to a person of authority. And I said, because you're bothered by this, I'm missing my algebra 2 class or whatever, calculus or whatever class I was in at the time. And I said, I could sharpen pencils and stab people with that if that's what you're concerned with. Like, what is the difference between any sharp object and what I'm considering an accessory? Mm-hmm. And they didn't like that. And I had to, I know.
You're such a rebel. You kind of gave Harley's speech a little bit.
Look, so when Harley says, there's some part of that speech that is somewhat relatable. I kind of did it my way. I achieved these things because I worked hard for it. Like when I heard her speech, this is what I heard. Would you play?
I do have her speech. Yeah, I've got
let's play that.
Yeah.
I am honored to be the valedictorian, and I just want to thank absolutely no one. All of ya. The principal, the shop teacher that looks at my ass every time I walk out of class. Yeah, I see you. Have a great fucking summer. ever.
I basically gave the same speech at my sister's wedding.
So
Sorry for all the bleeping, everybody. She's also holding up her middle finger at the audience at one point.
I think what I'm hearing here is I've had to be self-sufficient. I've had to do this on my own. Mm-hmm. I've had to work hard. And as I stand here accepting this accolade, you need to know that I don't really think of other people as getting me here. I think of actually having to overcome other people and those barriers to get here. Now she's truly a rebel in this scene, and it does, it does cause a problem. It's I wouldn't necessarily say it's the right thing to do, but I think that's an interesting memory to have in the Museum of Memories, because it tells us that, like, yes, her childhood was hard. Yes, she had abusive parents. Despite her childhood trauma, she achieved really, really amazing things.
I would absolutely have that memory in my core memories. Like the time I not only outdid everyone else academically in my school, but I also stood up in front of the entire school and told everyone off. I would absolutely keep that as a core memory if that were something that I had done. But
yeah, it does make sense. And it tells us as the therapist in the story here, you feel like, if I were to take that story, I'd say it's a sad story. You feel that no one had your back.
yeah.
You feel that no one supported you. You feel like no one believed you. And even when you did the good things and you were smart and you impressed people, they still questioned you. So yes, I mean, there's a lot of layers to that. There's a lot of layers of emotion to that memory. Clinically, does it tell me something? I think it continues to tell me this is someone who does not have a lot of social support. Now, from childhood to this memory, this is someone who doesn't take into account, it's her, top of mind is not other people. And that concerns me.
But what it does tell us as well is that she was fairly independent and that she was strong-willed at that point, which we are led down the corridor and basically told to believe that she was not at some point, that she was not strong-willed, that she was a victim at some point.
Right.
Let's move to the real pivotal image on the wall, which has a glitch in it. And this is the image looking up at the catwalk as Joker and Harley, Harleen at this point, Harleen Quinzel, are over the vat of acid, and Harley is remembering that Joker pushed her into the vat. There is a little glitch in the memory, though. So you basically see him sort of pointing at the vat, and then we see her already falling off the vat. And she's like, well, that's weird. Like, there's a glitch in this memory. Maybe I repressed part of what happened. Mm-hmm. And
that alone is not uncommon. That when people talk about memories having gaps, mm-hmm. That's very, very common, especially for a traumatic memory like assault.
Yeah.
It's a very protective thing. Your body is trying to keep you from remembering something very life-threatening. And so your brain does create those gaps. So that alone could have been, like, her being a trained therapist would know, like, oh, that's just one of those gaps.
Right. Ultimately, there's a whole subplot of this happening. The group is being evicted, as they were told at the end of the previous episode. And because they are all in this comatose-like state, it's believed that they're dead. And there's a ticking clock here in this episode, because the landlord, who is a former spy, and his old colleague, possible former flame, they have decided that they're going to burn the bodies. So they are moving them all to an incinerator, or not an incinerator, but a pizza oven at an abandoned mall. And they are going to burn the bodies. So they all have to get out in time. They all realize this, and they are all trying to make their way out. Dr. Psycho is trying to lead them out safely before they're all killed. Obviously, he doesn't want to die. And what ends up happening is they end up seeing this very hellish landscape island sort of across the way, and he says that this is basically where all the really bad memories live. Any of your repressed memories would be there. That keys into Harley saying, well, maybe the repressed memory or the repressed piece of memory of that Joker incident is over there. Let's go. They all agree to go over there after some coercing. They go over there and they see the memory in full. And that is that Joker never pushed her. She actively made the decision to jump herself. And all these years have gone by. She has thought of herself as a victim. She has thought of herself as someone who unwillingly became the right-hand henchwoman to Gotham's most notorious villain. She didn't think she had the agency at the time. And what we're learning is this is a moment when she was basically lured. She was coerced. I liken it almost to that of a cult. And what people are willing to do for cult leaders, no matter how intelligent they are. In fact, you and I have watched many documentaries about cults, and we have learned from all of them, because there's always a psychologist that's an expert on cults. They will always say, people ask me, how stupid do you have to be brought into a cult? And I tell everyone, the smartest people I know have been in cults. So you take someone as accomplished as a Harleen Quinzel, and something about this charismatic cult-like figure, this villain of the Joker, convinced her that in order to prove her worth and her willingness to do anything for him, she had to jump into this vat of acid, and she did it. And that is probably more traumatic to her than anything else, is the realization that she was caught up in this way. Yeah.
She was able to rewrite the narrative throughout the years to imagine in her reality that he pushed her into the vat.
Yeah.
That the helplessness that she felt as a child, that the isolation, the abandonment she felt as a young adult, that all of that is the same even in this situation where her boyfriend violently pushes her into the and the vat of toxic sludge is then what it's supposedly what caused the Joker to look the way he looked, and she explains like that's why she looks the way she looks. So there's this there's the physical disfigurement, but also what it there are some other elements of what this does to a person.
Yeah.
But the key situation there is that in her newly clarified memory, what actually happened is that he gave her the choice and that she was willing to jump to stay loyal to him.
Yeah.
Now, we have to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of trauma to make some sense of this, because this was kind of like it's such a meaningful moment in the episode, and it made us realize, and her friends realize, like, look, you need to know that you have choices. Mm-hmm. Like in this moment, even though you don't remember it this way, you had agency, you had a choice, you have self-control, and you need that back because that's something you lost when you were with him. And you talked earlier in the episode about chronic traumatic exposure, like what happens with the experience of multiple traumas.
Yeah.
And while I said having a smattering of hardships is not only actually common, but could build some resilience depending on the social support you have. When you are exposed to a lot of trauma, and especially within the context of an abusive partner, your nervous system is out of whack. What does that mean? You're on high alert. Sometimes I use the word hypervigilant. Sometimes psychologists will say it's when we say hyper-aroused, that's what we mean, where typically in life we have a scary moment of a hardship, a traumatic event. Typically what happens is our nervous system reacts normally, and then we have what we call a rest and digest phase, which is the calming down, the nervous system repairing for what just happened, that fight or flight arousal, that being on edge. And so what happens if you're mostly hyper aroused and you don't have enough of that rest and digest period, you kind of like live on that edge. You kind of experience your nervous system as, I would say Harley Quinn for sure has this overactive, dysregulated nervous system where, because of all the trauma and all these traumatic events that she's experienced, that's the way her nervous system kind of is in terms of her baseline. And so why does that matter? Well, it has some impacts to our brain. So there's 3 parts of the brain I'm going to mention here. The prefrontal cortex, which is all of that thick, important brain tissue, just in our forehead there. When we have a lot of exposure to trauma, some of that those cortices can shrink. And so what that means is that during those traumatic events, you're on edge, you're hyper aroused, you have kind of less activity in the cognitive systems. So like thinking, problem solving, higher level.
So when people go through intense trauma and they react impulsively, it's because their frontal cortex is not processing and cognitively working out the problem in another solution.
Exactly. Love that you said that, because it may mean some people may be more impulsive. They may not think things through. They may lash out. And there are other parts of the brain that I want to mention that are also affected by trauma. The 2 other parts are the hippocampus and the amygdala. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that processes emotions. And so as you can imagine, the amygdala is driving the fight or flight response. And so if that's super active and your prefrontal cortex is not as active or is lacking communication between the amygdala and the cognition,
that's where like secondary degree murder comes in.
Oh,
I mean, I'm not really, I'm sort of like, if you are super hyper focused on the emotion and that's not regulated properly, and your frontal cortex is not processing how you should otherwise solve this problem, and you're not really cognitively thinking about it, that's what then drives you to do something that you didn't go in thinking you were going to do or meaning to do, and then that's how you end up getting into trouble.
Yeah, yes. And by the way, I'm using some simplified language to kind of get us to target in on some of these particular brain processes. And I'm talking about experiences over time, because again, 1 or 2 difficult experiences, aren't necessarily bad for us, but chronic exposure to trauma, like Harley has had, could create this dysregulation in the brain. And also, I said I'm oversimplifying things. Think of this as a computer where, like, right now I'm talking about like having all these different apps up, and like, let's say I'm using a web browser to describe the prefrontal cortex, and then let's say I'm describing Instagram to be the amygdala. Like, obviously there's other things in the computer working. This is a complicated system, and I'm just pinpointing some of the areas. So like, just know that, those are described in isolation here, but there's a whole interrelated, complicated system happening. And then I didn't mention the hippocampus, which is where we form memories related to emotions, especially. So the idea of forming and cementing memories, especially memories that have salient emotions, the hippocampus is responsible for that. All these systems talk to one another, communicate with one another. And what research has found is that in folks that have a lot of history of trauma, the hippocampus shrinks. And what that says is that, okay, cementing these memories properly is not happening in a functional way in a healthy brain, and that, like Harley Quinn's memories, some of these memories may be distorted. They might have gaps. They might be lingering. They might come up as flashbacks or nightmares, and they may be inaccurate. And this is one of those examples where it was inaccurate. And it was inaccurate because my whole understanding of this is that her prefrontal cortex had to make it make sense.
Yeah.
And to make it make sense was I had nothing to do with it. The only reason I was in this relationship is that I was totally helpless and I got pushed in. And from that moment on, I was out of control. And the reality was like, no, you also chose this.
Yeah. This conversation is very interesting, and it just leads me to one question. What happened to your hippocampus? Because you don't remember anything. Like you have the worst memory.
I really do have really interesting selective memory. And it's interesting because some of the most, one of my favorite examples is the movie Saw. If folks, I won't give the ending away. I actually don't know that I fully remember the ending right now.
I mean, you literally only saw it like last year.
I'll see a movie like Saw, and it is a very scary horror movie, and I think it is, and something will happen where I will forget the ending. And then when I see it again,
but you can watch any movie and you'll forget the ending. Like, it doesn't matter how scary the film is. I will ask you if you've seen this movie and you're like, I think I did. I don't remember the ending, regardless of what it is, unless it's something like Star Wars. If it's something like that, you'll remember. But like the beauty of you is that I can show you the same movie 30 times, in 30 years, and each time it'll be like the first time you've seen that movie.
It's like the very first time. And it's not intentional. It's not like I turned something off, but yeah, I've always wondered about that. If someone has an explanation. There are many movies like The Shining. Sometimes I can't quite remember if Jack gets out of the maze at the end. I've seen that movie so many times. Mm-hmm. Or whether the kid gets out. Like sometimes that gets real foggy. Sounds
like we need to watch The Shining tonight.
So yeah, there's a handful of movies that I think, especially movies that have very striking endings, like what did we just watch? See,
you can't even remember that.
Where the guy walks away, like the guy was in control the whole time. Yes, The Usual Suspects. That has started to escape the memory formation part of my brain because I'm like, can't quite make, and it's like very well known. That movie is very well known. So what ends up happening should be applauded, and I think it's the kind of thing that more of us should do cognitively, which is that she reclaims the memory. She decides to get into herself in the memory, which is not something she's supposed to be able to do, and she refuses to jump. And Joker asks her, well, what are you doing? You have to do this. This is your origin story. And she says, no, this is not my origin story. My origin story began the day I left you. Like the day I left and became my own person is my origin story. So she reclaims her origin story. She is no longer that person who just mindlessly jumped into a vat of toxic acid. She is someone who sees herself as being a new Harley. She is the one that exists now because she left the abuser behind. Yeah, that's really
important. It's a very powerful and a great usage of this show, I think.
Yeah, really really smart because I think the challenge of writing a show about Harley Quinn is separating her from the abusive relationship. But also, as I said before, you can't ignore it. You can't just erase it from the history and certainly from canon, because that also feels somewhat not unloyal, but that also dishonors this past that this character, I know this is not a real person,
has had to endure.
Yeah, it's almost like you just kind of discard and erase and dishonor something that that we shouldn't stigmatize. We shouldn't just kind of toss that aside. And what kind of story would we have? And I think this is a great idea the writers had. What kind of story would we have if the abuse is in her past and she's developing self-efficacy and autonomy and self-actualization in this new chapter of her life? Isn't that kind of relatable? Isn't that kind of interesting? And I applaud that. While it's not exactly like therapy, I do think what you just described, the exploration of memory and making meaning from those decisions. Did I make those decisions? Yes. What did it mean then? What does it mean to me now? And also that helps the hippocampus process and properly store and communicate the right things to other parts of the brain. And so, when we talk about neural plasticity, we aren't just talking about what happened to Harley when she was a youth. We're also talking about what's happening to Harley as an adult and her brain's ability to rewire and re-narrate what that means to her. And that's real. That's real science. So I think what they did with that is really, really cool. She's taking action, essentially turning on her prefrontal cortex to make sense of this memory, this story, in order for her to kind of move forward with the identity that she's forming for herself. The last thing I want to say about Harley Quinn is that she still is a risk taker. She still is essentially consistent through these different memories, through her childhood to young adulthood to now, in that she takes risks, she takes chances, she looks for adrenaline. And I think that's in large part related to the brain fatigue that we were just talking about. The high exposure to trauma, the hyperarousal in her nervous system, and the possibility that she's constantly in adrenal fatigue. So what does she seek? Dopamine, something that feels good, something that provides relief. And so she kind of has to dial that up compared to maybe the rest of us who can find that release and that relief in other ways.
Even in the case of this, where she knows that they are all about to be burned to death outside of her mind, and they need to leave, but she prioritizes going across the boiling lake, using Clayface as the, not Clayface, using King Shark as the mode of transportation across the water, and discovering this missing part of her memory. She prioritizes that over simply escaping and getting out. So even that, I would say, is risky to some degree. She could die in the real world, but she needs to know what she has forgotten.
Right.
And that that is interesting to me.
Yeah.
Go back 200-ish episodes.
No.
And there used to be
where my brain does that live?
I know you don't remember any of them.
Okay.
There used to be a little segment where I used to pull in things from the real world as examples of what we're talking about.
Sure.
I'm sure as a psychologist, you've heard the term memory palace.
I've heard that with a character, Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, the Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that's actually a thing. It's a technique that a lot of people use. Mentalists will use it quite extensively. But anyone can use it. It's a technique used in order to remember things you might otherwise forget. And the idea is that you have built a palace in your home, like her memory museum, and the way that you remember these things is what you're doing is you're not trying to remember. You're trying to remember how you get to the memory that you stored. So if you consciously in your mind envision a white marble palace and you walk down the hallway and you know that on your first left there are 6 doors on the left hand side and another 6 doors on the right hand side, you make that left, you go past 3 of the doors, the 4th door on your right has a lock. You reach into your right hand pocket, and in the pocket is the key, and you open the door and you walk through, and in that door there is a safe that has a 4-digit punch code next to it, and that code is 6247. And when you open it up, oh, that's where I left my keys. Like, oh, now I remember they're in the couch cushions. I remember that because, and the whole thing is you have trained your brain. You have been thinking about these other things as landmarks. So as long as you continue to remember, I locked that memory away in that safe, and I remember the 4 digits because they are this and this and this, and I remember how I got there, you can unlock that memory that, and it's shocking how well this works. I actually used to know, I mean, I still know him, but we don't talk as much anymore. But there was a guy who used this technique on a regular basis. You could ask him what he had for lunch that day, and he wouldn't necessarily remember. But things that were super important to him. And here's the crazy part. You might think, and I'm sure in most cases, someone would just be like, let me remember. This date.
Sure.
Is what I'm looking for. You could see him doing the memory palace, and like you could see him externally looking at him. He'd be like, all right, well, go down the hall and go into this. I go, and there's the safe, and there. Okay, so it's 624. So, oh, I know where my keys are. Like you would just, he would just do it. And he'd be like, oh yeah, I remember putting them there. And I remember thinking, you got to remember where you put these. So I locked it away and I did this and this. And I would just be like, that is crazy pants. Like, how are you doing that?
Okay. And so this is where, memory is quite fascinating because not everyone can use that technique. I think you do need to have a visual memory ability. Like your memory foundationally works in a visual way. Like I think that would work well for me, where I cannot process many things unless I'm actually in my brain visualizing what that is.
Sure.
Some folks have said they don't visualize. Like when I tell you, like, think about a red crispy apple. Some people don't have that picture of that apple in their brain. Mm-hmm. They have either a different representation, a verbal representation, or some other way to kind of capture that in their processing of what that thing is. So I think what you're describing takes a very visual type of person.
It really does. And there's even a system, like there was a system actually called the Roman room system,
okay,
which is basically, it's a room filled with items. So if you're watching on YouTube right now, you can see that behind Drea, there are several Batman statues and figurines on one side. You've got a Christmas tree behind her left shoulder. You've got a blue chair off to the side. The idea is that in this room, there are pieces of furniture and important things, and you are going to associate certain things with those pieces of furniture.
Absolutely.
And so you'll pick which one represents this, and this is why I remember it. It's the chair. The chair is, whatever. And so, yeah, you really do have to, I suppose you wouldn't necessarily have to envision the physical room if you are simply remembering there's a room, there's a Christmas tree, a chair, several figurines and statues, whatever. Like, you don't necessarily have to picture it. You could just say the words and know it's the chair, because the chair is what I associate with that memory or whatever.
Yes, but I would argue that a visual representation of those memories is how this mnemonic works.
Yes.
And when you look at certain IQ tests, that is actually something that's measured, is your ability to recall visual, like items that you've seen, your visual memory versus other types of recall abilities. So you're also pointing out a couple of other differences, short-term memory versus long-term memory.
Yeah.
My hunch is that someone who uses the Mind Palace probably has really good long-term memory for these things, because they've created perhaps an elaborate mansion of all the things that they need to remember. And it takes,
in the same way that I have excellent long-term memory, not as good as short-term memory, certainly not anymore, not as I've gotten older. But I have excellent long-term memory because I associate that memories based on where I was living at any given time. So as a military brat, we moved around every few years. And so I can remember very specific things based on what room I was in when that happened, in what house, in what city, in what state, and then I'll be like, oh, that was definitely 1986, because I know that I was in my living room of the house that I had in Boone, North Carolina when that happened, so I can remember things, whereas other friends I've known who have never moved have no long-term memory, because to them it's all one big, it's all one big location. Every chair, that chair represents 40 years of their lives, as opposed to me, that chair only represented 4 years of my life. So if I remember that chair, it must be because we were in this place. Sort of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would argue that's also very visual.
Yeah. No, I'm not arguing against that. I'm saying I know it's not a conscious decision I made. Like, I did not build a memory palace in my mind, but because I remember that memory taking place in a certain place, I remember it better. And to me, it's almost the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, it must have been here. It must have been at this time.
Well, and when we use memories in therapy, we ask those questions. Do you remember what you saw in the room? Do you remember were there any scents or smells that you can remember? Was there a song playing, or what did you hear? We're trying to bring those senses back to that time and place and recall as much as possible. And some people are really good at this. And some people, while they may not be good at it, or may not be good at it, the moderating factor is the likelihood or the intensity of some kind of traumatic experience during that time. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting, because sometimes the traumatic experience intensifies pieces of that memory. And sometimes, as I mentioned, it backgrounds or kind of dissolves pieces of the memory in protective ways. So it's always important to think about, especially if you're processing this or working with this in therapy. We talked about this in the last episode when we talked more about a certain technique called EMDR. Yeah. But, and I will say such a generalization, but I truly believe this as a counselor, that most, if not all, trauma therapies are effective because the client is doing exactly what we're talking about. They're processing something that happened in the past and resolving it, repairing it, remembering it in a way that makes it more acceptable and calming and less scary in the now. It's not about change. And I always start with this in therapy, we can't change. This isn't endgame. We can't go back in time. But in a way, we are going back. We are going to explore those pivotal pieces of those memories, or those pivotal memories, and let's make sense of them in a way that it's not scary anymore, that it's less arousing to you, and that, you know, your brain's not all, and I'm kind of pointing again to the front part of my brain, like, let's give reasoning back to this so that you can move forward and not have this continue to haunt you. So there's different ways to speak to that, but by far, that is what therapy is essentially doing.
Dre, I would say that this is a pretty powerful episode.
I really, really encourage people to watch episode 5 of season 1 of Harley Quinn, because it can be really, really powerful. Yeah.
Now, what I don't remember, this is always the episode that I remember us watching way back when the show first started, but we've not really continued very far after this. So I remember bits and pieces about what may have happened after this, and I'm sure I'll remember more as I watch them, but I did not store the rest of this show into my memory palace. So I do not remember what's coming up. I've been excited about touching on this one because I knew it was such a big deal, her reclaiming her origin story and all of that. And so I was excited to get here. Now I'm excited to see what's beyond it because I genuinely do not remember. But we'll find out in a couple of weeks in January 2025. Very excited. Until then, I want to thank a couple of people who have helped make this episode and all of our episodes possible. They are, of course, our patrons: Mike Ficklin, Dr. Jerome Anderson, Antonio Lopez, Kevin Ortel, Todd Stashwick, Hero's Journey Fitness, Trevor Schwartz, Aaron Wenrick, Mark Pepper, Swara Salih, Frank Moeller, Jamiroquai J, SK, and my father, Carl Ward. Thank you all for contributing. You too can get your name called out in the next episode of the podcast. Simply go to patreon.com/Arkham Sessions. And for a $5 contribution, you can get your name called out just like all of these folks did. Until next time, Drea, why don't you tell the good folks where they can find you online?
You can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com, on Instagram and Threads as Dr. Drea Psychology. And again, mentioning the Discord, you can find the link in the bio of the Arkham Sessions Instagram. Please join us there for free. And that's mostly everywhere. You can find us.
You can find me. I am on Instagram at B_Ward028. I guess you can also find me on Threads there too. You can also find me on Blue Sky.
Yeah.
I don't know what that name is because I think it's a weird one. Isn't that one where you're Brian.Ward.Blue? Yeah, you know what? Look me up. You can find me there. I think I've only got one post there so far because I'm now new to it and I've decided to embrace it. So yeah, you can find me there. Arkham Sessions, you can find on Instagram. We are at the Arkham Sessions. Like I said, follow us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Arkham Sessions. Not only do you get your name called out, but you also get an opportunity to hear the episodes early. You also get an opportunity to see the video versions of the episode a season early before they actually hit YouTube. And so you can also vote on what we're covering next. For only the $3 tier, you get to be part of our polls. So yeah, come do that. And like Drea said, join us on Discord, follow us on Facebook, and be sure to follow our good family over at Fanbase Press. Check out their news, check out their comics, check out their other podcasts. They're a good group of folks. You're going to love them. And we look forward to seeing you all in 2025. Until then, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
Can I fix her? Of course I can fix her. I'm just gonna slip inside her brain, do my thing, wham bam, thank you ma'am, and I'm done in 2 minutes.